In the spring of 1829, a tenant farmer working the fields near the Delaware, Maryland border made a discovery that would expose one of America's most chilling criminal enterprises. His plow horse suddenly sank into the earth, revealing a wooden chest buried beneath the soil. Inside lay the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a man, his bones yellowed with age and his skull showing clear signs of violence. This was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, authorities would uncover the bodies of at least 7 people on this property, including 3 children, all victims of a woman whose name had already become a whisperetta throughout the Delmarva Peninsula, Martha Patty Cannon. For nearly 2 decades, Cannon had operated what historians now call the Reverse Underground Railroad, a network that kidnapped free African men and escaped slaves to sell them back into bondage in the Deep South. But this wasn't just about human trafficking. Cannon was also a serial killer who murdered rival slave traders, witnesses, and even children when they posed a threat to her operations. Court records from Sussex County, Delaware, show she was indicted for 4 murders, though witnesses claimed the true number exceeded 20. Before we continue with the story of Patty Cannon and her reign of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, I want to hear from you. What state or city are you listening from? The reach of Cannon's criminal network extended far beyond her Delaware stronghold, touching communities from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta. Leave a comment and let me know where you are hearing this story. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. These dark chapters of American history deserve to be remembered. The discovery of those buried remains would ultimately unravel a criminal conspiracy that had operated with virtual impunity for over a decade. Protected by jurisdictional confusion, racial prejudice, and the simple fact that most of its victims were people whose disappearances went largely unnoticed by white society. The area where Patty Cannon built her empire of terror was uniquely suited for criminal activity. In the early 1800s, the region now known as Reliance sat at the intersection of 3 jurisdictions: Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This strategic location allowed criminals to literally step across county and state lines to escape pursuing lawmen. The spot was so remote that locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, named for the tavern that would become the headquarters of the most notorious kidnapping ring in American history. The landscape itself seemed designed for concealment. Dense forests of pine and oak stretched 4 miles, broken only by marshy lands and small clearings where isolated farmsteads dotted the countryside. The Nantucket River wound through the region, providing waterways that could transport captives silently under cover of darkness. Roads were little more than cart paths, and the nearest substantial towns were days away by horseback. For someone seeking to operate outside the law, it was an ideal location. Martha Cannon, called Patty by those who knew her, had arrived in this borderland sometime around 1790. Court records suggest she was born around 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Handley, though she kept her origins deliberately vague. Some accounts place her birth in Canada with immigration to Delaware at age 16. What is documented is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a local farmer who owned property near the state line. Together, they had at least 1 daughter and lived what appeared to be an unremarkable rural life. Jesse Cannon was described by neighbors as a quiet man who kept to himself, working his small farm and raising tobacco and corn like dozens of other settlers in the region. The Cannon homestead sat on a modest plot of land that straddled the Delaware-Maryland border, a detail that would prove crucial to Patty's later criminal act. The house itself was a simple two-story structure built in Thickerman style of the period with thick wooden walls and small windows. What neighbors didn't know was that this seemingly ordinary home would soon house secret rooms and hidden spaces, designed to conceal kidnapped human beings. But beneath this veneer of normally lay something far darker. The early 1800s marked a crucial period in American slavery, when Congress banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808. The demand for human labor in the expanding cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia created a lucrative domestic market. A healthy adult slave who might have cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $1,000 in the Deep South. This price surge created powerful incentives for criminals willing to traffic in human misery. The economic transformation of the South following the invention of Theckerton gin had created an insatiable demand for enslaved labor. Cotton was expanding rapidly across the Gulf Coast states, and planters were willing to pay premium prices for workers. The legal ban on importing slaves from Africa meant that the only source of new enslaved people was the domestic population, either through natural increase or through the capture and re-enslavement of free African moons. The Delmarva Peninsula was particularly vulnerable to thieves. Following the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people had been freed by their owners, either through gradual emancipation laws or individual acts of manumission. Maryland and Delaware had substantial populations of free African men who worked as laborers, artisans, and small farmers. The said communities, while legally free, lived in constant fear. They had no powerful protectors, limited legal recourse, and their disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated by white authorities, who viewed them as less than fully human. The legal status of free Africanomans in the early 1800s was precarious at best. While they were not enslaved, they possessed few of the rights enjoyed by white citizens. They could not vote, serve on juries, or testify against white defendants in most courts. Their freedom could be challenged at any time, and they were required to carry papers proving their status. For criminals like Paddy Cannon, these legal vulnerabilities created opportunities for exploitation. Into this environment stepped Paddy Cannon, a woman who would prove that evil recognizes no gender boundaries. Contemporary accounts describe her as a large, physically imposing woman with unusual strength for her gender. She stood nearly 6 feet tall in an era when most women barely reached 5 feet, and she possessed what neighbors described as an intimidating presence. Her voice was reportedly deep and commanding, and she had a reputation for violent outbursts when crossed. Her husband Jesse died under mysterious circumstances around 1826. Some later claimed she poisoned him, leaving her a widow with complete control over the family property. By this time, she had already begun forming the criminal connections that would make her name synonymous with terror. Local law enforcement was virtually non-existent in the rural border region, and what little authority existed was softened, corrupt, or simply overwhelmed by the scale of criminal activity. The social dynamics of the region also favored criminal enterprises. The white population was sparse and often transient, consisting largely of small farmers, laborers, and people seeking to escape their pasts in more settled areas. There was little sense of community cohesion, and neighbors often minded their own business, regardless of what they might suspect about their neighbors' activities. This isolation and indifference would prove crucial to Cannon's ability to operate undetected for so many years. The transformation of Patty Cannon from frontier widow to criminal mastermind began with her daughter's marriages in a pattern that would define the next 2 decades. Both of the young women's husbands were slave kidnappers. Her first husband, Henry Brighton, was a blacksmith who supplemented his income by capturing free African Americans for sale in the South. In 1811, Brighton was arrested and imprisoned in Georgetown, Delaware for kidnapping, but he managed to escape from jail that same year. Brighton's criminal activities had been well known in the local community long before his arrest. As a blacksmith, he had legitimate reasons to travel throughout the region, visiting farms and settlements to shoe horses and repair tools. This mobility provided perfect cover for his illegal activities. He would identify potential victims during his legitimate business calls, noting which families had teenage children or young adults who might bring high prices in southern slave markets. The methods employed by early kidnappers like Brighton were often crude but effective. They relied on deception, overwhelming force, and the isolated nature of rural life to capture their victims. A common technique involved approaching free African American families with offers of employment in distant locations, parents desperate for economic opportunities for their children would sometimes allow them to travel with these supposed employers, only to discover too late that they had signed their children's death warrants. It was after his escape that first documented murder connected to the Cannon family occurred. Brighton, working with Patty Cannon and another criminal named Joseph Griffith, ambushed a slave trader known only as Rigidel at Cannon's tavern. The plan was simple but brutal. Get the victim drunk, rob him of his money and slaves, then eliminate the witness. Court records show that Rigel was shot and killed during the robbery. Brighton and Griffith were eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813. But Paddy Cannon escaped prosecution. The Rigel murder marked a significant escalation in the criminal activity centered around the Cannon property. Prior to this incident, the family had been involved primarily in facilitating kidnapping and providing safe haven for criminals passing through the region. The willingness to commit murder for profit demonstrated a level of ruthlessness that would characterize all of Cannon's future activities. Contemporary newspaper accounts of the Rigel case provide disturbing details about the crime. The victim had been traveling through the region with a substantial amount of money. Estimates suggest between $3,000 and $5,000 intended for purchasing enslaved people in local markets. He had stopped at what he believed was a legitimate tavern for food and lodging. Unaware that he had walked into a trap, the conspirators plied him with alcohol throughout the evening, waiting for the right moment to strike. When Rigidel finally retired to his room, Brighton and Griffith followed him. Neighbors later reported hearing shouting and the sound of a struggle followed by a gunshot. By morning, Rigel was dead. His money was gone, and his wagon and horses had disappeared. The body was hastily buried on the property, beginning what would become a regular practice of using the isolated location as a dumping ground for murder victims. The execution of her daughter's first husband did nothing to deter Cannon from her chosen path. Instead, it seemed to refine her methods and strengthen her resolve to build a more sophisticated criminal organization. The lesson she drew from Brighton's capture was not that crime didn't pay, but rather that criminals needed better organization and more careful planning to avoid detection. When her daughter remarried, this to meet her Joseph Johnson, Cannon gained a partner who would prove even more valuable to her criminal enterprise. Johnson wasn't just another kidnapper. He was a businessman who understood the logistics of human trafficking on a regional scale. He had connections throughout the South, experience in transportation and logistics, and most importantly, the The capital necessary tokes panned their operations beyond simple opportunistic crimes. Johnson brought to the partnership a tavern located on the Delaware-Maryland state line. This establishment, which Becker made known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was positioned so strategically that different rooms literally sat in different states. This geographic advantage allowed them to move kidnapped victims between jurisdictions to confuse pursuing authorities. When Delaware lawmen arrived with warrants, suspects could simply step into the Maryland portions of the building and claim immunity from Delaware jurisdiction. The tavern served multiple purposes in the expanding criminal enterprise. It was a legitimate business that provided cover for their activities, generating income and explaining the constant flow of travelers and wagons through the property. It functioned as a holding facility for captives awaiting transport south, with specially constructed hidden rooms and cellars designed to conceal human cargo. And it served as a meeting place for the network of criminals who worked for them. A neutral ground where plans could be made and profits divided. The physical layout of the tavern reflected its multiple functions. The main floor appeared completely normal, with a common room for travelers, a barrier, and rooms for legitimate guests. But beneath the building lay a series of cellars